Hey everyone, it's James Lindsay, and you're listening to New Discourses Bullets, where I give a short bullet point-like summary of one topic relevant to woke Marxism that we need to understand so we can defeat it. And I talked in a previous episode of the Bullets about a concept that comes from the abuse literature, psychological abuse or narcissistic abuse specifically, that's called DARVO, D-A-R-V-O, which is a acronym. It's not a word in and of itself. DARVO, and you'll see me put this on Twitter all the time, DARVO stands for deny, attack, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. So those are your D-A-R-V-O. Deny is D, attack is A, reverse the roles of is R, victim is V, and offender is O. This is a tactic that is used by narcissistic and psychopathic abusers to, when they're called out, to flip the table. It's to turn the tables back on the person calling them out. And it's extremely common in abusive relationships. It's extremely common in abusive relationships with your government or with your media. And so I call this out a lot. And this isn't an episode, since I already did one talking about DARVO specifically. I want to talk about a specific kind of DARVO that appears within woke infiltration. And I'm going to be a little broader than I often am. And I'm going to be very blunt here, that this happens both on the left and on the so-called right, the fake right, the woke right, if you want, the right hand of the left. We don't have a great name for this phenomenon of far right, cringe right, alt-right. What right do we want to call it? But not the real right, the faux right, the fake right. I don't know which right to call it, but it's not the right. It's because it acts like the left. But calling it the right hand of the left has infuriated them in the past, and calling them the woke right has infuriated them in the present. So I like both of those terms. But they are people advancing conservative values, and we'll talk more about them in an episode soon, using conservative values that are being, or not apparently conservative values, being advanced through leftist methodologies, dialectical methodologies, the same kinds of word games and traps, the same kinds of setups, the same kinds of manipulative behavior, the same kinds of lying, the same kinds of blending truth and lie. That's another topic for another podcast. But I just want you to have on your radar that there is a left that is woke, and there is a right hand of the left that is woke, or a woke right that we can refer to. And in fact, I bring up and spend some time on them here talking about this particular brand of DARVO, which I haven't even told you what it is yet. It is the You're Divisive DARVO, because it's extremely common at the beginning of a campaign. We are now in a very deep rut with woke. Woke, in fact, is not new. Woke is getting old. For all intents and purposes, although it's older than that, woke has been a major player in our culture for 9 years at the least. Late 2014 to early 2015 is when it broke out, at least under Black Lives Matter, into our culture in the mainstream. Not just a bunch of snowflakes, as they said on college campuses, but actual activism in our cities using woke ideology to drive it. So we're talking, 8, 9, 10 years of people being subjected to woke. It is not at the beginning of its campaign any longer. So while it does use the particular DARVO that I'm going to describe here, which I don't have a great name for, so I'm going to call it the You're Divisive DARVO. It's more common to see that at the beginning of a campaign or of a radical splinter movement than it is to see it in a fully matured one. And so we don't see it as often from the left, although we do sometimes. I also have noticed that it crops up particularly more often in churches than it tends to crop up in other spaces. And I think that there are reasons for that have to do with the fact that the church is kind of supposed to be a unified community. But you will also see this You're Divisive DARVO technique cropping up in workplaces or anything where there's supposed to be some kind of cohesion amongst a group of people, because what it's using is the concept of divisiveness. It is in fact being divisive and then calling out people who point out the divisive tactics and say no, and accusing them of being divisive in return. So that's how this DARVO works. I'm going to make the case, I think, after I explain it a little bit more, which I don't think it's that complicated to explain, that this is actually the Mao Zedong unity criticism, unity formula put into practice. And I just want to point out to you that I did a podcast on that as well. And so you can go listen to the whole unity criticism, unity idea, a bullet podcast on that. Or you can listen to the long podcast I did where I read through Mao Zedong's entire speech where he introduced the importance of that concept in 1957. Just to kind of tell you that stuff's out there. There's other resources. So the way this your divisive DARVO works, remember, deny, attack, reverse the roles of victim of offender and offender, is the way this works is that some radical group infiltrates or comes along as fellow travelers, and they introduce a radical policy not everybody's going to agree with. That already is divisive. It's immediately divisive when it gets put on the table. It could be an accusation of racism, for example, in the workplace would be a great example. Accusation of racism in the country did this, split the country in half when George Floyd died. You can picture that in your diversity trainings you've had at work. These accusations are leveled, and you get the kind of fracturing of the workplace environment. Same thing would happen in churches. Somebody puts forth a policy that is radical and transformational, so it's dialectical and left in its orientation. It's got a divisive quality to it itself, and so long as you go along with it, everything's fine. But the second you say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? They turn around and point at you and say, you're being divisive. You are causing division because now you're the one preventing the unity, where there was previously unity and going along with their radical idea that people hadn't realized maybe was a bad one. And now somebody has spoken up. So the person who spoke up is the divider rather than the person who put forth the intolerant policy in the first place. And then, like I said, this is exactly the Mao Zedong unity criticism, unity formula put into practice. Mao would put forth some kind of a policy, and he would say, we're going to have unity moving in the direction of this policy. And then if anybody disagreed or dragged their feet or called it out, those people were being divisive to that new unity that he was calling for. And so they were subjected to criticism and struggle in order to correct their values. And then there could be, in his words, after you solve this contradiction or resolve this contradiction between the people, he said you could then have a new unity on a new basis. And in other words, you have an organization, let's call it that, that's moving in a particular direction. And we'll call that unity on the old basis. So they're all headed towards something. And then some new policy comes along that wants to take it some, let's say 5 degrees or 10 degrees off course to go somewhere different, right? And that's going to be a new unity on a new basis when everybody goes along following that new course. And if you say, wait a minute, we should stay the course, we should stick to what we were doing in the first place, this is a radical change and a bad idea, they'll say that you are the one who's now causing the split. Because before that, everybody was veering along with the new unity policy. And then you said, no, let's stick with the old policy. And so you caused people to wake up and therefore split a sleepwalking organization that was going off the wrong direction. So you become the divisive one, calling people out for introducing radical and intolerant policies in line with Mao Zedong's unity criticism, unity program will result in you being criticized for being divisive. That will be the specific nature of the criticism. So you become the divider. So that's going to try to get the mass of the people, even the people who agree with you, to turn on you for their natural desire not to have conflict in the organization or in the group. And so you got to remember, Marxism and the dialectic operate through generating productive conflict. It is a conflict theory of the movement of history. So somebody comes along and introduces the policy that will induce conflict, and then they say that the conflict hasn't occurred until somebody says no, at which point you now have these two poles that are fighting over what direction to go. And that person gets labeled divisive so that people will go along with the new program and or the organization will break in half or split. And So, as Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto, there will either be a radical reconstitution of the society at large, or there will be the common ruin of the contending classes. That's how he phrased it. And this is that formula. So what this looks like in practice is it's a DARVO. They put forth a divisive policy, and you call it out, and that's the moment the DARVO begins. Narcissists don't hit you with DARVO. Radicals don't hit you with DARVO. Gaslighters don't hit you with DARVO until they get called out. So they put forth a radical policy, and here's what you need to understand. The division occurred there. The second that happened, even if people were mystified or confused or going along and it sounded like a good idea, the division happened there. And that's very important. So they put forth a divisive policy. Sometime later, you say no, and they deny it wasn't divisive, and they attack, you're divisive. And they reverse the roles of victim and offender. The organization is under attack, so it's the victim, but now it gets turned into the offender. And I've heard story after story after story from owners of small businesses who are terrified of their own employees because they think that their employees are going to do a woke DARVO on them of this kind. If they say, no, let's stay on mission, let's try to do what we actually envision for the company. This is the owner speaking. They're afraid of a woke backlash. This is, I've seen extremely common in Christian circles. In Christian circles, what I see is that somebody comes along and proposes a policy that is a radical departure from what should be going on or what has been going on, whether it's woke or whether it's woke right, whatever we want to call it. And then somebody calls it out and they say, you're calling out Christian brothers. You shouldn't be doing that. You're divisive. That's extraordinarily common. I, of course, am severely disempowered in this regard since I'm not, to anyone's knowledge at least, I'm not a Christian, and I portray myself as not a Christian at the very least. I say it this weird way, by the way, because I've decided nobody needs to know what my religion is any longer, and I'll never tell anybody again. But it's perceived and likely true that I'm not a believer at any rate, and therefore when I get this accusation, it goes further, and if I work with a church and I say, here are things that are happening, and you got to be careful not to go along with woke right or woke left policies, and you got to stay the narrow path. Talking with churches, they'll say that the church has invited in an atheist, specifically with the agenda of dividing the church, and he's the divider, and the people who did that are actually divisive. And so I'm very disempowered, but I've noticed that it doesn't really matter if I was a Christian or not, because when Christians do this, they get the exact same damn treatment anyway. Christians don't care, because this isn't about being a Christian or not a Christian. It's not about calling out a brother or brotherhood or in Christ or any other thing. It's about creating a power play to advance a radical policy agenda or a radical activist agenda. And so, like I said, this is you're divisive form of DARVO. That's what it does, is it calls you out as divisive when you call out a radical departure from the mission or goals or purpose of an organization, specifically to discredit you and to add to the credit of the people accusing you of divisiveness, who usually are the people who have put forth the specific divisive policy in the first place. How are you supposed to deal with this? Like all of these things, this is just a toilet, honestly. You're going to swirl around and go down the drain eventually. It's a toilet when you get into DARVO situations. You're dealing with abusive, narcissistic, and psychopathic behavior. It doesn't get better, but the only thing you can do is expose it to as many people as possible by pointing it out. And in this case, that's why I made such a fuss a few minutes ago about saying the division began when the divisive policy itself was introduced. And so, or when the splinter group was added in as fellow travelers and started trying to radicalize the group off in a new direction. The division already occurred. The second, in language that I've given about DEI classes in the past, the second you start to make the accommodation for a new ideology, the demand to have a new ideology was already divisive, and to make room for the ideology was already divisive. And the second you grant accommodations to that, the division has already occurred. So that when somebody speaks up and says, no, we're not going to accommodate this or tolerate this intolerable new direction, they can turn around and accuse that person of being the divisive one and try to get them pushed out. You can see how what that does in practice is stops them from being criticized. With the woke right, they've got this goofy policy called netter, no enemies to the right, so that anybody who calls out somebody on the right in the present circumstances will be accused of dividing the right. But it's the radicalism itself, the intolerant radicalism, that's causing the problem. Of course, intolerant radicalism always needs to be called out. And the policy of you can't call us out or else you're dividing us, and it doesn't matter what. That could be the right, that could be a workplace, that could be a church, it could be woke right or woke left policy doing it. The fact of the matter is that when you have a policy like that we're all going to go in a particular direction, and you can't criticize people generally pointing in the right direction, or else you're divisive. You're dealing with you're divisive DARVO. And so, like I said, the only thing you can do about this is try to call it out and point it out and explain how it works to people so that it's not as mystifying. And then it's up to them. They're going to have to decide. And they should be able to decide, honestly, which path they want to follow. Do they want to go with the radicals on their splinter, or do they want to stay the true course? But they should be able to make that choice actually informed as to what's going on. I mean, some people want to go be radicals. I don't think that's a great idea, but that's their right, and more power to them. But I think that they should be able to make that choice clear-eyed, that there actually has been a split, and that the division was caused by the introduction of the radical policy. It was not caused by the person who called it out. And so be aware of this form of DARVO, call it out as an abusive tactic, as an illegitimate tactic, and be prepared to explain how it happens, where it happens, and what the actual divisive point was, and why it's necessary for people who want to be clear-eyed in choosing to stay the course, or even people who want to be clear-eyed in joining a splinter, a radical splinter group, that they know that the division happened with the introduction of the radical policies. You don't want to sleepwalk your way, which is how the communists or Marxists or dialectical operators in general, that they want you to sleep. That's how they want you to be. They want you to sleepwalk into some new transformed position. And so you have to be able to identify it and help other people identify it. And all that there is to do for that is to understand it, recognize it, and call it out and explain it for people so that they can make their decisions in a clear-eyed fashion. I think you will find that once that dynamic begins, if you've already allowed in radical splinter elements, that you're going to lose some portion of your organization. But at least the divisiveness needs to be pinned on the people doing it, because those people are insinuating themselves into your organizations in order to cause those divisions. And those divisions will get bigger and be more consequential and more damaging the longer they are allowed to fester before the call out happens. But once the call out happens, this dynamic is going to play out. It's going to be ugly. But at least you can go into this aware and ready to protect your organization and your members and fight back.